Greetings. I'm dr.chan, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. Today's guest is Dr. Scott Fischer. He is a board-certified psychiatrist and lead facilitator and clinical program manager at the Siegel Trial Center for Psychedelic Research located in Lauderhill, Florida. His work has included Phase 2 and 3 FDA clinical studies on psilocybin, LSD, and 5-MeO-DMT for the treatment of depression and anxiety disorders. He received his medical degree from the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in 2009 and is one of the only few licensed psychiatrists in the country with advanced certification in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy from the California Institute of Integral Studies. In today's discussion, we take a trip through magic mushrooms, LSD, and DMT, touching upon how they impact the user at the level of psychology, then biology, specifically neural networks and neurotransmitters. We discuss his role as a facilitator in psychedelic trials, what one might expect if they were to join a study, and the progress the trials are making in relationship to their use in the treatment of anxiety and depression. Several interesting subjects are discussed, but are not limited to Mckennas' stoned ape hypothesis, meetings with machine elves, and whether psychedelics enable us to view reality with more accuracy. As usual, we end with a round of rapid-fire questions. Feel free to skip around if you find any of these topics of interest to you. Hi, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing well, Aldrich. How are you?
Good. Thank you for asking.
Yeah,
So you are currently leading Phase 2 and Phase 3 FDA clinical studies of psilocybin, LSD, and DMT for depression and anxiety. First of all, could you clarify to the audience what Phase 2 and Phase 3 actually means? And then let's jump into psilocybin and the other psychedelics.
yeah. So the FDA is the government agency, on the federal level that is in charge of drug development. And so if when a new drug gets approved to be used in the U.S. by doctors, then it has to be, or other prescribers, it has to be approved through the FDA. And so the FDA has over the years come up with a pretty regimented process for how that drug approval looks. It starts with what we call sort of like preclinical work. So this is animal testing, this is lab testing. So like that's before phase 1. Now phase 1 is generally the first in human studies, and those are basically usually just safety studies, and they're checking blood levels and monitoring the all the major organs and seeing if there's any really adverse effects. And from there, the phase 2 and the phase 3 are when you start to look at what we would call like efficacy or effectiveness of a specific drug for a specific condition, diagnosis, or what the FDA calls like an indication. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the first study that we worked on, at Siegel Trials, was a phase 2 study of psilocybin, the drug, for the treatment of major depressive disorder, the diagnosis, or what the FDA would call the indication. So that's a pretty critical step. Those are, bigger than the phase 1 studies, which are usually, a dozen or a few dozen, subjects being tested in the study. And now we're moving on to, 80 to 100, few hundred in the phase 2. Mm-hmm. So if that looks positive, then, you can, and safe and positive in terms of looks like it's effective. And phase 2 studies are usually what we call some sort of placebo control. So you're really testing the drug versus a placebo. And then in phase 3, you're still going on to placebo. And these are what we call randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. Randomized being, the study participants could be randomized to either the drug or one of the drug treatments or to the placebo arm. Blinded in the sense that the participants or the research subjects don't know. Double-blinded in the fact that the treatment providers also don't know. It's only afterwards that the analysis is done. Mm-hmm. And placebo-controlled, that part I already mentioned. So the phase 3 then go on to be even larger studies than the phase 2, often several hundred research subjects being tested. And you need to have at least one phase 3 study showing effectiveness and safety. Often 2 or more the FDA requires for then you to apply to the FDA for what's called a new drug approval.
Mm.
The FDA reviews that and then decides, okay, will we approve this drug for the condition it was tested in the phase 2 and phase 3 studies. So, for instance, right now there is a company called Lycos, which has a very close association with a group called MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which is a nonprofit pretty well known for helping kind of be one of the main groups, nonprofit organizations that has spearheaded the renaissance, quote unquote, of psychedelic kind of medical research.
Mm.
But Lycos has right now a new drug application being reviewed by the FDA of MDMA assisted treatment for post traumatic stress disorder.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of a, I guess, a brief overview of kind of the
Yeah,
different kind of phase 2 and phase 3.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for the summary there.
Yeah,
So,
no problem. So,
so
so
I
where I work, Siegel Trials, we're known as a clinical trials site. So we get sponsored. Sorry to interrupt. We get sponsored by companies who are usually doing multi-site trials. The phase 2 and phase 3 are usually done at sites across the country to kind of help make sure that these studies, as much as possible, would be valid for the general population, aren't in specific populations or specific areas.
mm,
So we are often one of a dozen or sometimes several dozen clinical trial sites around the country running the same protocol.
okay,
Yeah,
excellent. All right. So I definitely want to explore some of the findings and results that you've all run into at this point. But before doing that, let's dive into some of these psychedelics, the fun part of the conversation for I think lots of
sure.
people listening. So you've already mentioned psilocybin, and for those of you who don't know, psilocybin is of course the psychoactive ingredient in the psilocybe mushroom or the magic mushrooms. They've actually been found to be used in religious rituals, and there are cave paintings, right, from 6,000 years ago of mushrooms in Spain, and they've been used throughout Central and South America as well. And more technically, they're well known to be correlated to the neurotransmitter serotonin, particularly targeting the 5-HT2A receptors. And I'm wondering at this point, could you speak more to the technical neurochemistry behind it and its relationship to its effects?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some things that we know there, and most of the stuff we would like to know we don't know. So
Mm,
psilocybin and other kind of well-known psychedelics, and there's lots of different classes and lots of different flavors, and they're all different
mm,
molecules with different effects on the body and the brain. But psilocybin, LSD, um, some of the other well-known psychedelics, mescaline, seem to have a lot of their effects based on activation of the serotonin subtype 2A receptor.
mm,
We know that if you give a drug simultaneously with psilocybin and LSD that blocks the activity of the 2A receptor, then people don't have a trip really, and they don't experience the subjective effects of the psilocybin. So that pretty much proves that a big part of what it does, at least subjectively, in terms of what people experience in terms of the psychedelic effects or the trip, um, have to do with activation of that receptor. Because if you block it, then they don't have the trip. So
mm,
in terms of, we know that has downstream effects on other neurotransmitter systems, glutamate system, for instance, um, is also thought to be really important in the psychedelic effects. But, we still don't really have very good models for how to build from these kind of very micro level, like the serotonin 2A receptor, how many of those are in the brain? I don't know offhand, but like we're talking probably millions, if
mm,
not billions of those receptors in the brain. How does that add up in terms of long term sort of neurological or brain effects? What's the sort of like what is sort of happening there, uh,
mm,
and how do we connect it all together? We don't know. We know that once you really get to a larger scale, and these are things that you might find on fMRI or functional
mhm,
MRI sort of neuroimaging, where
mhm,
you're seeing kind of in real time blood flow in the brain, which is a proxy for brain activity,
mhm,
on a very macro level now. Um, we know that there are certain effects that happen. For instance, there's a relatively recently discovered network of brain regions called the default mode network. the default mode network is we see it very active when we're just kind of in our own head. We're
Mhm.
thinking about our day, that little voice that often is going on in our head. Reviewing yesterday, making plans, daydreaming. It's just kind of that's why it's called the default mode network, because it's what's active when we're not necessarily doing a whole lot, and a lot of us spend a lot of time with the default mode network active. Um, just kind of in our heads or daydreaming or, planning, things like that. So we know that that's when it's active. We also know it goes inactive when we're really focused on, say, doing something. There's some cognitive task, we're trying to figure out a math problem, or, we're doing something with our hands, that we're really involved in, a pianist, really involved in a piano piece and just focused on the music they're playing. Advanced meditators also, they're able to get their default mode network to go very quiet. But we also know that if you give a strong dose of a psychedelic, then the default mode network can go very quiet. And so, the question is that somehow important for their putative therapeutic effects? Um, and we don't necessarily yet have any, I would say, good evidence that default mode network deactivation correlates with therapeutic outcome. Um, but there's kind of some hand waving arguments out there. We know the default mode network can be overactive in depression and OCD and anxiety, which kind of makes sense. People often get very stuck in their heads and their ruminations,
Mhm.
and it's kind of the same routine of thoughts and things like that. Um, so could if overactivation of the default mode network is important in these depression, anxiety sort of pathophysiology or underlying causes, so to speak, um, could then giving a psychedelic and kind of quieting those, could that sort of allow for some sort of therapeutic effect? It's a hypothesis that we don't know the answer to.
Mhm.
There is really interesting work though. One component of a psychedelic sort of experience can be sort of the loss of a sense of self. People feel like
Mhm.
they die or they disappear. The technical term we call that, we use ego dissolution. And it's seen that if on the fMRI, the higher degree of default mode network suppression or deactivation that happens with this psychedelic, the more people afterwards are likely to say, yes, I felt my sense of self,
Mhm.
disappear, or it felt like I was dying. And, that isn't always necessarily a terrifying or bad experience. Some people find that actually very blissful. Other people do find it kind of terrifying. Other people, it might be kind of neutral. So,
Mhm.
yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, tidbits we know about kind of some of the brain and body effects of psychedelics, but really painting a full picture right now, I think we're pretty far from that.
Right. Okay. It's interesting how you brought up the networks and you've basically predicted some of my questions that we're moving forward. The
Okay.
default mode network, I was particularly interested in talking about because that's actually the network that I studied in at University of Miami.
Oh,
I
great.
did research on in relationship to post-traumatic stress disorder. But of course, I'm also, I'm a big meditator. And, there is some crosstalk between the literature and like you're mentioning, with the DMN, I know that some recent studies have found a decoupling, right, of the medial prefrontal cortex as well as the posterior cingulate cortex, which are two core nodes of the default mode network. And this reduction of the posterior cingulate cortex seems to be correlated with reductions of experience of self, right? One of the ways of, for the audience, this might be helpful. One of the ways of remembering some of the functions related to the default mode network is as the OATS network. I don't know if you heard this one before. It's for
Mhm.
others and the self, but there's also mental time travel. So I think of others and mental time traveling selves, we could say. Um, the stranger, the easier it is to remember. But in any case, these sorts of functions, seem very much to be related with, like you said, ego dissolution as well as time potentially standing still for some time and so forth. So, are there other particular areas salient in the brain that tend to be inhibited versus excitatory that was maybe a surprise to you?
Other like kind of brain networks, are you asking, or?
Yeah, networks or regions or.
I'll be honest, I'm not 100% an expert on some of the neurophysiology of the psychedelics. My work is mainly more clinical, and
Okay.
nowadays, a lot of the neurophys doesn't necessarily have clinical applications yet.
Mm.
As you might
Okay.
know, we don't diagnose any clinical disorders really via, at least in psychiatry, via any sort of neuroimaging, or at least that's not an accepted standard of care. So,
Yeah.
I find all the neurophysiology very fascinating, but just not very clinically relevant yet. Um,
Okay.
yeah, if there's certain areas that you had in mind that you
Mm.
wanted to explore, I'd be happy
Well,
to.
I was actually curious to hear your opinion on this idea because there are some researchers out there and people who have the opinion that there's actually overall less activity that's happening in the brain when an individual is undergoing some psychedelic, specifically psilocybin. And do you think there's less activity, equivalent activity, or even more activity in our brains happening in comparison to everyday waking consciousness when someone is on, let's say, psilocybin?
Hmm. Yeah, I've seen kind of a fair amount of variety or heterogeneity in reports like these, and at first there comes out and say, oh, it seems like there's more brain activity, and then other reports will say there's less brain activity, and I think even the state of our neuroimaging is kind of in its relative infancy, and it's I think it's getting to be better quality, but up until a few years ago. Um, my understanding was a lot of fMRI studies could be really hard to replicate. Um,
Mm.
in which case you wonder if, people are really, if you're not able to replicate it, then you wonder about the validity of some of the findings. So, I think at this point, we really don't know that much
Mm.
about the answer to that question. And
Okay.
um, if you think about, you know, the variety of subjective effects
Hmm.
that can happen under the influence of a psychedelic, and even for one given individual within just one dosing session, they can have a wide variety of effects, which
Mm.
must almost certainly must correlate to a like a wide variety of kind of brain states or brain activity.
Hmm.
So then, if someone is having moments where they are feeling, really, quiet and present, and everything feels really silent during their trip, we might wonder if at that point their brain is kind of quiet. Maybe they're having lost a sense of self. The default mode network is suppressed. But then if at another point in their trip they
Hmm.
are just thinking wildly, all sorts of thoughts are coming to them and memories,
Hmm.
then we'd probably expect that the neurological state is also very different. So
Hmm.
um, I think, when it comes to making generalizations about large scale sort of brain sort of activity kind of states, um, it might be hard to just sort of say, oh, psychedelics make the brain more active, or they make the brain
Hmm.
less active, or,
Hmm.
certainly there might be some tendencies or some trends, but I imagine there's also a lot of variability in what they
Yeah.
do from person to person and from trip to trip and even moment to moment, in a
Hmm.
dosing session.
Mm. And definitely there are phases to the drug once it's taken, right? That goes through
Yeah.
time, and that may induce different levels of activity, and so that specificity is important to consider. So the
as
reason
well
why
as, as well as as well as a dose response relationship that could be very
Mm.
different. If people take a small
Right.
dose of psilocybin, they don't tend to get a lot of default mode network suppression, and
Mm.
the sort of levels of drug being given in the lab are not commonly taken in the
Mm.
community. Actually,
Hmm.
we're giving much larger doses than kind of the average, say, psilocybin user, out in the community would take,
Hmm.
kind of on their own. So,
Mm.
yeah, that's I think the dose response relationship's another part of that
Okay.
equation that like to think about.
Right. Right. Um, so let me finish this thought off because so the people who are suggesting that there's less activity overall, they basically say that the idea that we can experience more consciousness with less activity in certain scenarios, which also happens, for example, in near death experiences, it's been used as a way to argue that the brain might be more of a filtration mechanism, and when that filter expires, so do we sort of return to the mother sea of consciousness. What are your thoughts on that sort of idea?
I mean, it's a really interesting hypothesis, and maybe it has certain beautiful aspects to it.
Mm.
Is the brain less active in near death experiences? Well, we would assume it is. I don't know, near-death experiences. I'm far from an expert, but I have an interest in them. I don't know at this point there's any really good studies of,
Mm,
brain activity during near-death experiences, because we don't usually have people in an fMRI
mm,
or on an EEG when they're on the verge of death. But I mean, there's a kind of long history of, you know, seeing the brain and the mind, the human mind, as sort of a filtering, mechanism of consciousness, and really just shining a flashlight in, very limited areas that are, probably evolutionarily important for human survival.
mm,
Um, and that, if you kind of are able to kind of reduce those brain mechanisms causing that kind of flashlight to be so narrow and concentrated, then you might get a sort of wider experience of consciousness. A really interesting idea, and also gets into some metaphysical areas that are interesting as well. But I think from a scientific standpoint, that's it's hard to make much comment on that right now.
mm. Okay. So,
How do you feel about it?
sorry.
What do you think about that idea?
Oh, I'm kind of on the. Well, I would call myself a pan-experientialist, and sometimes I sort of vacillate with some form of objective idealism, and so I am open to that idea actually. But I'm not. It's more of a placeholder. So I always keep myself at a bit of a distance, but I do think it's important to be aware of these placeholders. These are basically the foundational meaning systems that we operate from. Now,
Mm,
lots of people these days operate from a fundamentally a materialist, let's say, background or understanding, but then they also believe in free will, right? If someone is a reductionist materialist, believes that everything can be reduced to matter, then you can't really believe in free will. So
mm.
there's already incoherence there, right? And so for me, having these placeholders is important. And there are very, very interesting debate that's happening right now in relationship to consciousness studies and so forth. Um, uh, but let's return to you. Um, one question that I think would be interesting to bring up is, of course, Terence McKenna and Dennis McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis. And I'm sure you've heard of this. For the audience, it's the idea that psilocybin was introduced into the human diet right around like 100,000 years ago, and it resulted in a transformation and advancement of cognition. And it basically sort of moved Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. Um, what are your thoughts on this? And, you know, feel free to be, uh, you know, speculative.
Well, I think there's a lot of different angles to think about there. Certainly, we look at sort of transmission of cognition, and there can be, what are the cultural memes that are affecting our cognition and the way we think and feel about things. And certainly psychedelics can have a big effect, I think, on the way people think and feel about things. For instance, there's some studies showing that people, when they take psychedelics, if they kind of start from that more materialist view of the universe, are more likely to move to sort of more of an idealist kind of view of the universe, and seeing consciousness as primary, and not things as primary. So, the fact that psychedelics can kind of have a measurable shift on average in that way is pretty remarkable.
Mm,
Um, if you think that maybe the changes in cognition that happened from early humans to Homo sapiens, etc., are also the result of genetic changes. Um, well, that gets a little bit harder to, I think, figure out, because you wouldn't, it's not known at this point, and would be probably uncommon to think that psychedelics affect the germline.
mm,
So are they making changes at the level of DNA? Um, you know, that's being passed down from generation to generation. You wouldn't think that psychedelics likely do
mm,
that, and you'd have to take them before you had kids.
mm. How about epigenetics?
Epigenetics, could they, have kind of brain changes that then are perpetuated? Um, you could. I think you still have to get pretty creative to
Mm,
account for the big changes between humans' brains and apes' brains.
mm,
So I think it's a creative idea. I would be
mm,
surprised if it's really that true. Um,
Okay.
I think, psychedelics have probably had a big effect on cultural memes
Right.
of humans, but in terms of really changing the fundamental biology, um, I don't know. I'm open minded, but it's hard for me to kind of connect all those points together at this point.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you for
Yeah.
your opinion on that. I'm thinking now we can return to the concrete, we could say. And I wanted to ask you, the position that you're in is a very special role. And I wanted to hear a little more about what does a typical session look like in your study? I imagine there are, again, phases and kind of what's the beginning, middle, and end look like for anyone that might be interested, for example, in participating or becoming a psychedelic therapist?
Yeah, so I mean, right now we have three studies that are active. Two for treatment-resistant depression for people who've tried, medications in their current episode of depression and they didn't work, and another for kind of anyone with what we would call major depressive disorder that's active right now. And we have a few more studies that we expect to activate. One for postpartum depression very soon. One for PTSD, a generalized anxiety disorder, and depending on when people are consuming this content, it could be different at that point. So it's
Mm,
kind of each of the studies, they usually last at least a year, sometimes a couple years, and then they're finished, and then we move on to others. So um, each study is a bit different in terms of some of the specifics, but there's kind of some generalities.
mm,
So there's a screening period where we do pretty lengthy assessments to make sure people qualify and we feel like it's safe for them to move forward. And then there's sort of a treatment phase of the study where people have one, two, or sometimes up to kind of a handful of doses. And then we follow people, usually for at least 2 or 3 months and sometimes up to a year afterwards, to kind of
mm,
see if, continue to get safety data as well as to just see how long uh, their treatment was effective, if it was effective or not. But, in terms of my work there, so I'm what's known as kind of a facilitator or a therapist. And so these drug studies are different in that we are really paying a lot of attention to what are the subjective effects of the psychedelics. And we know that if people take a strong dose of a psychedelic, they can have highly altered states of consciousness. And usually that doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of problems, but there occasionally people might do things that would be unsafe or unwise under a really high dose of a psychedelic.
mm,
So we have people like me there. First off, we do preparation sessions with all of our study participants.
mm,
That's usually at least 3 hours of preparation, sometimes up to 8 hours of preparation. And some of our studies will have many of them actually have a model of two therapists per each participant in our studies. And so the preparation is really a chance to develop rapport and comfort, for us to tell them about the study drug and kind of what the
mm,
effects may be like, how to, kind of maybe navigate or approach, the effects of those study drugs in ways that we might feel lead to a more productive and safe dosing experience.
mm,
Um, and for instance, we really try and teach people to be, open minded about things, curious, and also, you know, the majority of people who come through our studies do not have really challenging aspects to their dosing sessions in terms of
mm,
feeling anxious or paranoid or sad or angry or anything like that. But we do know it can happen for some people. And so we really try and tell people, if that happens, it might be okay. Just kind of do your best to be open to that experience, to fully experience it, and not try and fight it or avoid it too much, because the thought is that when that happens, it just tends to kind of persist more.
mm,
So we really kind of try and teach concepts of surrender and openness, curiosity, courageousness, as attitudes we would like people to engender during their dosing session if they need to. Um, and then, so there's the preparation, and then in the dosing sessions, they're always done, at our center. They're in very private, quiet dosing rooms specifically designed. They kind of feel like a comfortable living room like environment. There's private
mm,
bathrooms, so we basically have eliminated the chance of people having to run into people or strangers they don't know, like in the hallway or anything like that. There's a musical playlist that is selected for kind of helping guide a psychedelic journey.
mm,
And we offer eye shades so that people can really have an introspective journey. So, in the preparation, it's really, 3 to 8 hours of talking nonstop. In the dosing session, we as therapists are there for support, to help people if they're having a tough time, to chat if people want to chat or talk, process anything, tell us what's going on in their minds. But we really always try and guide them as much as possible back into that introspective state. So we give them headphones and an eye mask, and that seems to really kind of help people go inside and experience whatever it is the psychedelic is going to experience in their mind.
Mm.
And then afterwards, we do integration follow-up sessions in the few weeks thereafter to talk about their dosing, just kind of uh, process it. And it's not a, these studies are very non-directive, in that we're not usually doing any sort of specific manualized or protocolized psychotherapy,
Mm.
but very non-directive in terms of just letting, being kind of more, I guess, a client-centered, type
Mm.
of approach,
Okay.
in a lot of ways. Yeah.
So firstly, the dosages of psilocybin. Just focusing on psilocybin for now, because we're going to talk about LSD and DMT. But for psilocybin, what does that look like? Is there like a low, medium, high dose, or is it or how does it?
Um, so it kind of depends, and so a lot of people are familiar with, I guess, the weight of dried psilocybin mushrooms.
Mm.
So someone, for a microdose might take, zero point 0.2 grams of dried psilocybin mushrooms.
Mm.
For a more, kind of psychedelic lower dose, they might do 1 to 2 grams. Terrence McKenna was kind of famous for saying take a high dose, 5 grams of dried
Mm.
mushrooms to really have a profound sort of alteration in your consciousness.
Mm.
So we're not using dried mushrooms. We're using pure psilocybin.
Mm.
So the therapeutic dose often studied, most commonly, is 25 milligrams of pure psilocybin.
Mm.
And it really depends, how would you correlate that to mushrooms? It would depend on what type of mushroom
Which from you have,
you're
right?
taking, because there's some that are more potent, some that are less potent. But we're talking, probably close to the 5 gram of dried mushrooms sort of
Mm.
territory, with
Okay.
25 milligrams of pure
Mm.
psilocybin.
Okay.
So that's, there's a couple studies that are looking at smaller doses, but so far there hasn't been a lot of evidence of effectiveness at, for instance, say like 10 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't seen strong evidence of it being effective. So
Mm.
they're really meant to be large breakthrough doses, where we would expect large amounts of default mode network suppression, and a range of other sort of more profound psychedelic experiences that
Mm.
are less common at lower doses.
So is what's going on, the mechanism of change, a big part of it, that the brain becomes potentiated into a state of susceptibility to increased neuroplastic changes? Is that what's sort of going on?
So, we've seen in animal models, definite markers of neuroplasticity.
Mm.
So, we would think probably that's happening in the human brain too, but we don't have that. That's a really kind of hard study to
Mm.
do, in terms of showing neuroplasticity in humans,
Mm.
because we're not able to really get brain samples of people
Mm.
that soon after their psychedelic experience. Um, so
Well, I
it's
mean,
really
there have been reports of long-term effects, right? Like in the Johns Hopkins study, for
long-term
example.
clinical effects. But in terms of,
So,
is that in any way related to any sort of brain change at a macro or micro level? I don't know of any
mm,
evidence at this point,
okay.
showing a long-term neurological change. Um, Really, maybe hardly at all in humans.
Mm.
Even default mode network suppression,
Hmm.
is can be very prominent during a high dose, psychedelic session.
Hmm.
Uh, but in terms of, showing that to be something that continues to happen afterwards, I don't know right now of any,
Hmm.
neuroscience findings that have shown that. So
Okay.
we're still kind of it's still, the neuroplasticity is based on, animal models of what
Hmm.
happens in psychedelics, and so it's
Okay.
really probably a really good hypothesis about, what could
Hmm.
happen to humans. But
Hmm.
we're really far from showing that any sort of healthful or salutary effects of psychedelics are related to neuroplasticity or any other sort of specific brain change.
Okay. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah,
So,
I'm often kind of a stickler for what are the hypotheses versus what's the actual data,
yeah.
because it's
Well,
often
it's good
conflated.
considering the position you're in.
Yeah, I mean, it often gets very conflated. other podcasts or
Mm.
other sorts of media out there, it's often not distinguished
Hmm.
in terms of what the actual data shows. So
What would be your opinion if it wasn't a functional or structural change in the brain that would correlate with lower levels of depression or anxiety? What would you speculate would be?
well, I mean, I think that probably I would speculate that there are kind of brain changes that
Okay.
happen. What exactly are the nature of those?
Mm.
It's hard to say. Like, we don't even really know what's
Hmm.
happening in the brain when people are depressed.
Hmm.
So even wondering what would be the brain changes from sort of the depressed brain to a brain that isn't depressed, we couldn't even start to say, okay, well, it could be this or that or this. Like, we don't know. Our science is not even advanced enough to be able to tell, to distinguish the pathophysiology, like the sort of the depressed brain versus the undepressed brain. We don't really have
Hmm.
anything there that to hang our hats on at this point.
Oh, interesting.
I
I
mean,
haven't heard this view. So
be
like when people,
little, there's sometimes little, sort of things that we're able to tell about the brain, but in terms of like, we can't do any sort of, really brain study at this point and be like, oh, that person is depressed because of what we see on this fMRI or this EEG. Um,
hmm,
so I think that probably there is, um, there are brain changes that occur as as a result of psychedelics that happen over the long term, because
hmm,
people do seem to get better from even just like a single or a few dosing sessions, and sometimes be better for years.
hmm,
But what is happening, I don't know. And to me, the brain is, to kind of go back to the materialist versus idealist. It's the brain is somehow involved in kind of meaning making, and so to that extent, what we are experiencing subjectively as a result of brain changes is actually what is of most interest. Like, people um, only care about if their brains are being fixed, quote unquote, or helped, insofar as they are able to experience those differences in their consciousness and in their lives.
hmm,
So, if you were to say, well, we've fixed your brain problem, but someone is saying they still feel depressed, then, what use would that be? So I think we live in such a science centric sort of society, and the field
hmm,
of medicine and psychiatry have really just wanted to focus so much on kind of the science of things. But at the end of the day, I still think the best markers for what works and what helps people is what they say, you know, they feel and what they're experiencing, because that's what we really care about as humans.
right, right. Excellent. Okay. For the sake of time, I'm gonna push us forward. I have so many other questions for you, but um, so before ending our chapter on psilocybin, I wanted to ask you. I think it's important for people to be aware of the risk factors that are involved, because people get very very excited about these psychedelics, right? And so maybe you could share what are the most common risk factors, and maybe what are some things that people might not really consider as a risk factor, but is.
Well, that's a good question. Of course, the sort of work I'm doing is in extremely controlled settings with
Yeah.
very, very carefully selected sort of participants, you know, entered into the study. So, from that standpoint, I don't know that we've seen um, a ton of serious risk factors in these studies. Um, but there are a few that have popped up, and I think we're actually still just, there hasn't been still a lot of clinical research done with psychedelics. We're getting
Mm,
probably close to maybe a couple thousand people at most have gone through some of these studies at this point. A lot of them really pretty recently, because we're only now getting into bigger studies. A
mm,
lot of the research done at Hopkins and you know NYU and stuff, 10 years ago, like, they would have maybe a couple dozen people in their studies. So, and in very specific populations. So, I do see reports sometimes of increased kind of thoughts of suicide that people
mm,
experience during their dosing sessions or sometimes thereafter.
mm,
Um, And we don't always know if that is correlated with getting a high dose, or maybe some people get a placebo, and get very disappointed because they're not experiencing a side effect. So, could psychedelics for certain people cause them to feel worse afterwards? Like that seems probably that is likely to be true. And could that get to a level where is dangerous? They might harm themselves or try to harm themselves, or even end up committing suicide. That certainly seems like a possibility.
Mm,
um, there's also been, just kind of case reports, that some people might experience psychosis or mania or other sort of serious episodes after taking a psychedelic. And for instance, in our studies, we exclude people with any kind of personal history of mania or
mm,
psychosis, or even a first degree family history, parent,
mm,
sibling, child
mm.
who has had psychosis or bipolar.
Does that
Mania.
apply? Does that apply equally to all psychedelics?
Um, I don't know that we have any good data about whether that even should be occurring. That's
I
just,
see.
in our studies, basically almost all the studies I've seen, those groups are excluded. Should
Excluded.
they be excluded? We don't know. We don't have really good quality data. This is more kind of um, a preponderance of anecdotal evidence of
Mm,
this happening in some people, but um, it's really scant in terms of how, if those sorts of people should not take psychedelics,
mm,
um, or not. We don't know, but we do know that some people do seem to experience very serious psychiatric effects after taking a psychedelic that seem likely to be attributed to taking the psychedelic.
yeah. I mean, I've definitely seen a few in my own practice, actually.
Yeah,
This
I've seen definitely some in my past practice, as well. So
right,
there's probably something there. Exactly what the nature of it is, we don't know yet. So
right. I
um,
guess it'd be hard to come up with a study and say, oh, if you have a if you have a history of schizophrenia or first degree member, come in and we want to give you psychedelics and see if you develop psychedelic induced psychosis.
right. Yeah, no, that's, I mean,
Yeah,
at this point, the ethics of doing studies like that would be hard. I
yeah.
think eventually people are gonna, there's some people that think maybe, a low dose of a psychedelic could help someone with, say, a bipolar depression, or if maybe
Mm,
bipolar type 2 could take a low dose in depression and be okay. Like there will be, I think, eventually some of these studies done, because there is a need. Back in the 50s, they would do studies where they would give schizophrenics, psychedelics, and that's the area of research that dried up really rapidly because they weren't seeing
mm,
anything that looked,
mm,
promising. Versus, um, there was a lot of research being done, in say alcohol use disorder, back in the 50s and 60s, giving
mhm,
LSD or other psychedelics. So there were areas that looked promising, and have kind of continued on now into, this more modern era of research. But
mhm.
I don't think, giving psychedelics to people with psychosis, is
Right,
likely to be an area of research that happens anytime soon, if ever.
right. Yeah, it's
The
interesting. You
first
said you
degree
mentioned.
one, sorry, the first degree, maybe. I mean, maybe some people could take those, but you know, yeah, right now that's being avoided in the studies.
It's interesting that you mentioned alcoholism, right? Given that one of the interesting factors with change for people with alcoholism is the experience of a spiritual experience or a mystical experience, which can be induced at times with high doses of psilocybin, right? One more question for you with this actually. I know, so you've been using or doing studies on psilocybin in relationship to anxiety and depression, right? Or is it just one?
We've had several studies of depression. We also did a study of LSD for generalized anxiety disorder.
Okay, but for psilocybin, then mainly depression.
Oh, for psilocybin, so far, depression, yes.
Okay, okay. And can you speak to the results, whether they've been promising up to this point, or?
Yeah, so we've had, two. The first study was a study of psilocybin for major depressive disorder, sponsored by a nonprofit based out of Wisconsin called USONA.
Mhm,
They're a really, really cool group, and they published in JAMA last year, which is, one of the
mm,
biggest journals, at least in the U.S. And the psilocybin showed a really marked reduction in depression compared to placebo. The placebo group actually got better too, so there was a placebo effect
mm,
in the study.
interesting.
But the psilocybin group just got a whole lot better, and their results really maintained over the course of the study follow-up, which I think was about 12 weeks.
Mm,
So that was a really very positive study without any serious safety adverse effects in that
mhm,
study seen. So
mhm,
they are now, we're starting work on their phase 3 study. We're actually going to have our first dosing session next week
mm,
of psilocybin for MDD. So they're major depressive disorder. So they're moving on now to the
mm.
phase 3, but their phase 2 work was strongly positive.
Interesting.
And then the LSD for generalized anxiety disorder was a phase 2 study, and those results haven't yet been published in like a peer-reviewed journal.
Okay.
But the group that sponsored it, called MindMed, have released the results that kind of they're still in the process of analyzing, showing that the higher dose LSD dose patients also had strong therapeutic effects compared to
Mm.
lower doses or placebo.
Okay.
Yeah,
So yeah, let's move on to LSD. Thanks for sharing that.
yeah,
Um, so maybe we could start the discovery of LSD, right, was by Albert Hofmann. Hofmann was a Swiss chemist, and at 32 years old, he was already tinkering around and creating a stimulant specifically for the circulatory and respiratory system, but it failed. Well, at least no one was interested. And then years later, he revisited it and decided to resynthesize it. And then April 16th, he accidentally absorbed a little bit into his skin, had fantastic experience, we could say. And then April 19th, which is now formally known as Bicycle Day, right? He went on his famous bike ride where he actually ingested 250 micrograms, right? And there he described all sorts of experiences, the kaleidoscopic images, circles, spirals, synesthesia as well. And again, I know that the 5-HT2A seems to be very connected, but definitely the trip between psilocybin and LSD is quite different. So I'm wondering if you can maybe share a little bit about at least what we know. I'm sure most of it's a mystery, but what do we know about the how LSD might differ?
well, how is LSD different than psilocybin?
Yeah, first from maybe a bit more technical perspective in relationship to the effects. It's kind of like the road that I'm taking.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're in completely different sort of chemical categories. First
Hmm.
off, psilocybin is a tryptamine with a pretty close homology with serotonin.
Hmm.
Um, well, psilocybin, when it gets activated in the body, is actually a phosphate group is cleaved off to psilocin, and psilocin is very similar to serotonin. Psilocin is also very similar to DMT, which is in ayahuasca. Um, but LSD is what's known as a lysergamide. It's a much more complex structure chemically. In terms of the different sort of like kind of receptors that it's
Hmm.
activating, it's different than psilocybin, but they do overlap in terms of the 2A activation.
Hmm.
Um, but in terms of what are the different sort of effects on the brain between LSD and psilocybin, I don't know that we have a whole lot in terms of macro sort of differences known.
Yeah.
And I would say that actually most people would say the psilocybin and LSD experience are much more similar to each other than say psilocybin with mescaline, or psilocybin with MDMA, or
Mm.
psilocybin with ketamine. So I don't know that at this point we even really have very good research showing that there is systematic sort of subjective differences in the experience of LSD or psilocybin,
Hmm.
um, and more just kind of what people's opinions are, and kind of more anecdotal evidence in that regard. LSD does last kind of twice as long.
Mm.
Psilocybin's kind of 5-6 hour experience, and LSD can be 12 or sometimes more hours if you take a really high dose of it.
Mm.
Um, I think an area that is also very interesting is um, how indebted psychedelics research and psychedelic use in Western culture are to traditional cultures and indigenous groups and people. So, psilocybin was really introduced to Western culture via indigenous peoples in what is, certain parts of what is now called, Mexico. And that, so they've kind of kept alive a tradition of using psilocybin mushrooms that has now made them available to kind of Western culture in a way that, who knows if it ever would have happened without those traditional cultures. LSD is a semi-synthetic derivative of ergot, which is a fungus that um, has, I think it's a parasitic relationship with rye and barley and other sorts of grains. And
Mm,
ergot was used by indigenous sort of European cultures for uterine bleeding and things like that. So that's why Sandoz, the company, the pharmaceutical company Hoffman worked for, was even had an interest in making these sort of ergot derivatives. One of which, was LSD 25 that he later accidentally found the psychedelic effects of. So,
mm,
and the list goes on in terms of most of kind of the psychedelics that we know of or use are only because traditional kind of cultures already had identified them as being of interest and of value to human use.
mm. Okay. Yeah, that's all very important to consider. But
Yeah,
what?
I think in this age of cultural appropriation and kind of whitewashing the history of psychedelics and a lot of other aspects of our culture, it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that how fundamental that is to the
Mm.
importance of these in our society nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. People have asked me before if I'm in support of like recreational use of psychedelics, and it's not that I'm against psychedelics. It's more so that I'm more so for spiritual uses of it, or to continue the sacredness and the profound impacts that they can induce in individuals. It's not just a drug to be taken lightly. And you're already, mentioning how much of it is still a mystery to us, in so many different levels. I keep asking you these questions to get more specific details, but a lot of it seems to be still up in the air. Um,
Yeah, and I mean, if you looked at the way the Western sort of medical mind looks at these things, people from traditional cultures would say, "What? Why are you even talking about that or looking at it this way? These are have a completely different sort of import to speak with ancestors or
mm,
to somehow travel for divination for completely
mhm,
different." Ways of looking at the world. So there's a million different ways of looking at psychedelics. I think there's a lot of different ways of using them in ways that are healthy or at least neutral.
mm,
There's clearly some ways of taking them that are unsafe or unwise, it would
mm,
seem. And so, yeah, I'm also very interested in sort of what people would call, the spiritual kind of experiences that happen from them, and
right.
then the variety of conditions where if people have a mystical type experience, which is kind of defined in the scientific literature as having strong feelings of connectedness, feelings of transcending time or space, um, deep feelings of bliss or love, that if people experience that during their treatment session for depression or anxiety, that correlates with a better outcome in terms of the
Mm.
effectiveness. So
Well, what's so interesting about those the statements that you just shared that relate to how we define a mystical experience is that many of them seem to actually be more factual in nature. And maybe I'm waxing a little more philosophical now, but it's, for example, the idea that relationship is something that is very, very, um, well, it really is very matter of fact from multiple levels of analysis. If you're looking at physics all the way to the air we breathe, it's very connected, yet many of us feel isolated in our minds, right? And so it kind of, in a sense, the mystical experience brings you closer to what is fundamentally true. And, at least from an experiential place. Now, I do have a question that connects to this that comes from a student of mine, actually. And so there was a study that looked at the brain functioning and LSD and finding that it induces a synchronization between sensory and somatic motor networks, but also a disintegration from associative networks. And it basically leads people to view heightened sensations and perhaps or experience heightened sensations and have vivid hallucinations as connected to it. But that being said, some people do believe that when they are on LSD, they view the world with more accuracy. Um, Do you have any sort of thoughts on that, or do you think it's just more perceptual distortion?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I think, a lot of people will, come away from, are they perceiving, just through their senses, you're asking, a more
Mhm.
accurate perceptual representation of the world.
Mhm.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess maybe some people will feel that. Not necessarily everyone, though. Like a lot of people, if, let's say, for instance, they're looking at a painting of, the ocean, and they're on a high dose of a psychedelic and it looks like the waves are moving.
Mhm.
Most people don't think that actually represents the painting is actually moving in that way, but just
Mhm.
that they are experiencing the painting kind of in that way.
Mhm.
Um, I guess when I think about, you know, I would look at it a different way in terms of people might have psychological insights or spiritual insights that they perceive as being true that previously hadn't been really available to them, or that they may have doubted, beforehand. So, mystical experience is one thing that we really look at, and people might come away saying, yes, everything is connected through, some sort of force of love. And before taking the psychedelic, I didn't really experience the world in that way, and now I think, that maybe that really is true, and
Mhm.
that's sort of a metaphysical assertion that the psychedelics seem to have occasioned, for
Mhm.
them. Or they might come away with, psychological insights, like, oh, I see now that, my, difficulty, you know trusting men was because of how my father, was, abusive to me as a child, and I never really had sort of made that connection,
Mhm.
in my mind before the psychedelics. Sort of during the psychedelic experience, I came to that realization. That's sort of a psychological insight that thereafter, they might ascribe truth to. But I don't know. I guess I'd be curious to hear more about like what sort of that idea that what people perceive through their senses is somehow a more accurate representation, of the world. Because that's not an idea I'd come across before, to be
Right.
honest.
Yeah, I mean, the person framed it as sometimes, at least in different phases. Again, we have to view it more sophisticatedly, but in different phases, there are some phases where, if, for example, if you're looking at grass or the sky, the colors just seem more vivid, or they just seem, the image seems to be sharper. Um, Now, what I kind of threw back at them, though, is the fact that this actually also depends on whether you believe at all that we're capable of viewing the the truth of the world, or whether what we're viewing is just a complete hallucination based off of evolutionary pressures that have carved the way that we perceive the world. So, if you do believe we can actually see a fraction of truth within the reality we exist in, then, again, the question is, are these more vivid images of places and colors and such actually representative of something real?
Yeah,
But
I mean, there's there's we really venture into a lot of opinion and kind of
yeah.
hypothesis in
Mm.
answering that. I mean, for instance, color. We know that the different colors we see correlate with different wavelengths of light. How much does that mean color is some sort of true representation of the world is a completely different sort of argument, I think.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reason to think that color as we experience it, um, maybe doesn't necessarily exist outside of our minds, but just different wavelengths of light are actually the truth. And so,
Mm.
I think, those sensory perceptions, and that could be sound or touch or anything, there's some sort of correlation with truth, but are they actually, you know,
Yeah. I think
representations
maybe.
of truth in the universe? Sort of, but not totally. I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like I think we're actually on the same page with this. That the insights gleaned from psychedelics seems to be more of a psychological, experiential sort of thing that can move somebody forward from a place that perhaps they were stuck in.
Yeah.
Um,
And some people
yeah.
have absolutely gorgeous, beautiful aesthetic experiences on psychedelics. I think those
Mhm.
can be really helpful for people if they experience some sort of visual beauty, artistic beauty. Some people will experience music in a way that is just so profound. I think
Yeah.
a lot of times those are also correlated with emotional sort of experiences as well.
Mhm.
But I think that, sometimes, the aesthetic kind of elements of a psychedelic experience can correlate kind of with certain emotions that can be, really important for people.
Yeah. I mean, the feeling of being moved is considered a self transcendent experience itself. It's a smaller one, but it is considered one. And so, I mean, what is happening is you're transcending yourself that you're trying to transcend and move forward from. And if these aesthetic experiences can do so, then it can lead to these potential changes.
Mhm.
So let me ask you this. Why LSD with anxiety and psilocybin with depression?
You'd have to ask the people that sponsored those studies. I don't know that we necessarily would have a scientific reason to do that. And
Okay.
there may be just a lot of other sort of factors that go into it. The fact that psilocybin was, I don't know how much detail to go into here, but psilocybin was sort of selected as one of the top psychedelics to start researching again. This movement really happened late '80s, early '90s. The first studies didn't really get underway until the early 2000s. There was some DMT work done that was a little bit disconnected from the main body of, I would say, psychedelic kind of
Mm,
research revival that happened, in the early 2000s. But they say they chose psilocybin over, say, LSD. LSD was by far the most heavily researched psychedelic in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
okay.
And then psychedelic research entered a period of dormancy related to U.S. drug policy changes that happened with the Controlled Substance Act, and just basically a stigmatization of psychedelics, altogether, and certainly, and including psychedelic research, unfortunately, even though the research up to that point had shown a lot of promise, in certain areas. So LSD, though, was, by far the overwhelming drug of
Mm,
choice in terms of
mhm,
being researched in these studies.
mhm,
Um, so why, psilocybin had received a bit of attention. There were some prominent studies that had happened, but just much less. And why was LSD so heavily researched versus, psilocybin and other psychedelics? That's hard to say as well.
mm,
Um, there's probably a lot of opinions about that. But anyways, the groups that decided, okay, we need to, and these were nonprofit groups because there's really been no government or there was no kind of pharmaceutical or biotech industry support of psychedelic research up until pretty recently, actually. Has government and the biotech sector come into psychedelics, and but a couple nonprofit groups I had mentioned, MAPS. There's another one called Hefter has sponsored a lot of the psilocybin research that
mm,
happened at Hopkins and NYU, et cetera, in the 2000s, early and mid 2010s. They chose psilocybin, one, because it was shorter acting than LSD. So they said, you know what, this is just going to be a lot easier to research clinically because you don't have to keep people in the clinic for 12 plus hours. You can keep them in there for 6 to 8 hours. And that's just
mm,
more practical. Secondly, they were still very worried about the stigma of psychedelics and that could affect their ability to do the research. And they're like, you know what? A lot of people have heard of LSD, and this was back in the early 2000s where psilocybin was pretty unknown, except to like college students taking it in their dorms and stuff like that. The average
mm,
person, if you said magic mushrooms, they may have heard of it, but psilocybin, nowadays we kind of, a lot of people have heard of it because the research, and it's just kind of been growing
yeah.
much more in popularity, microdosing, things like that.
Mhm,
Early 2000s, not many people knew what psilocybin was. So they kind of chose it as, the one they wanted to for the kind of these more practical reasons, not because they necessarily thought it was any more efficacious or better than LSD, but they were like, oh, we think it's probably just as good, at least,
mm,
and or close enough. And
mm,
no one's heard of it, so there isn't the stigma, and it's shorter acting. So a lot of the research now is being done with psilocybin, probably because this more kind of modern revival of the research started with it rather than the LSD. And the LSD, it's a long session, so it is going to continue to probably in some ways be a bit more challenging to use in the clinic than a shorter acting. Could it be, though, more effective than psilocybin for anxiety or depression or alcoholism? It could be. There's a lot of people, who have worked with these either back in the 60s or have done kind of what we would call underground sort of therapy work. There's a lot of people out there that think LSD is a really special psychedelic and
Hmm.
maybe is more effective than psilocybin. There's also really interesting research um, showing in animal models that so we talked about neuroplasticity sooner. I don't know if we really carefully define that, which you know I I think just to loosely define it would mean the ability of the brain to sort of restructure or change itself, make new connections between the different neurons or synapses. Would be a measure of neuroplasticity. So more neuroplasticity would mean the brain is capable of making more new connections and kind of more structural changes in that regard. And so a lot of drugs actually cause changes in neuroplasticity um, in animal models. Cocaine does, alcohol does. There's all sorts of changes in neuroplasticity happening. The question is, what exactly are the different sort of new connections that are happening? Well, what we're seeing in psychedelics is that in animal models is longer acting psychedelics, for instance, LSD or ibogaine, which is in iboga, which is a plant from Western Africa. Ibogaine can last like 24 hours in terms of the effects.
Wow.
LSD 12 hours. The longer acting psychedelics have longer windows of neuroplasticity after the dose in these
Hmm.
animals. Um, so could that have, if that is also the case in humans, could that mean longer acting psychedelics might have a longer period afterwards where people have more neuroplasticity or other sorts of positive changes? That's an area of research that's being done now, because there is kind of a movement to try and shorten psychedelic trips to make it easier to kind of give in clinical settings, so that people don't have to be in the clinic for the whole day or longer. But are these as effective? We don't know. So
Hmm. Weren't there also companies that are now trying to develop a new psychedelic that doesn't involve hallucinations?
so there. Yeah, what would you call those? Because if they don't
I guess
cause
they're not called
a
a
psychedelic
psychedelic.
effect, then they're not really psychedelics. I would say there's a lot of groups out there trying to find, and even some government sponsored research, trying to find, what are known as NCEs or new chemical entities that have some sort of structural relationship with psychedelics or somehow inspired by psychedelics that don't cause a psychedelic effect. But at this point, I don't know that any have been discovered that have shown any clinical relevance, but that area of research is still relatively early. And, that might be, say, advantageous. For instance, let's say psychedelics are risky to give people with bipolar disorder or first degree family histories, then maybe you'd want to give them something that doesn't cause a
Mhm.
psychedelic effect and still get some of the benefits. Whether those actually exist, we don't know at this point.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right, Scott. Let's move on to DMT. Um, so dimethyltryptamine, right? This is the psychoactive ingredient in the popular South American brew ayahuasca, usually made from the capi vine, which provides the MAO inhibitor, right, and then the chacruna shrub, right, which has the DMT. Um, Also short acting, right? 2 to 6 hours about. And most, well, at least I was just going to share with me, there was a purging phase that included vomiting, and some people get diarrhea. Nonetheless, there are a few things I wanted to touch on with DMT. One of them is the idea that, right now it is popularized as the spirit molecule, with the idea that our brain releases a large amount of DMT when we're passing away that may account for near death experiences. But I've also heard a counter to that, that our brains do not release enough DMT to explain away some of these experiences. What are your thoughts there?
This is where I really have my science cap on. There's no science that I know of about either
Mhm.
of those kind of hypotheses, so
Okay.
I think they're pretty speculative. I
Okay.
think the fact that there is overlap between the subjective effects of near-death experience and high dose, DMT sessions or high dose other sort of psychedelic sessions, I think that's really interesting,
Hmm.
and that's a tantalizing area of research. Um, but I couldn't go any further than that to say it's really
Okay.
fascinating that there is, kind of that potential overlap for some people in the subjective phenomenology of those
Hmm.
experiences. A lot of people who die and come back to life, actually, the majority don't have any of the classical near death experience.
Mm.
phenomenology happen, in terms of going through a tunnel or seeing bright white lights
Hmm.
or, meeting dead relatives or, loved ones, meeting, deity like figures, some of these
Right.
classical near death experience sort of
Mm.
things. Most people who die and come back to life don't have any of that. They may have had no experience at all. They're just like, I wasn't there for a little bit and now I'm back, so
Mm.
um, I don't know. There's the science of this area is just so much in its infancy.
Okay.
It's hard to say, but I think it's fascinating to think about. The DMT is known as the spirit molecule, and um, I think this is an area where there gets a lot of um, science starts to get conflated with opinion and hypothesis in a way that can be, sometimes challenging to parse out. But yeah, not to my knowledge has it been shown that there's an increase in DMT at the time of death
That,
for humans.
okay. What is so our brains naturally release NDMT? Is that correct?
I don't even know if that's proven at this point.
Oh, interesting. That's also hypothetical then,
Yeah,
because
I
I was going
mean,
to ask you what the
there's
natural function of DMT actually is, but if
yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've seen really good quality research reliably showing that DMT occurs in the human brain.
okay,
Yeah,
okay,
maybe in some animal models they've shown it.
mhm,
I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. So
okay, and so what receptors in the brain is DMT impacting? Is it back to the 5-HT2A or are there
yeah, the
other
two
ones?
A would be the relevant one there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we know anything else in relationship there? Like, I think I read something about the sigma 1 receptor or something.
I don't know. I know that, I mean, DMT, like I mentioned,
Mm,
is almost identical to psilocin, which is what psilocybin
mm,
is, cleaved to when it enters into your body. Um, there's, but, when people take DMT, it's not orally active. So you can't just take a pill of DMT and have it be orally active. Your gut immediately metabolizes it. So ayahuasca, they give an inhibitor of the enzyme that degrades DMT in the gut, so it can be orally active because there's that sort of enzyme inhibitor that is being given simultaneously.
mm,
Um, so in terms of having a pure DMT effect from just swallowing it, that's hard to do because it's given with a lot of other chemically active ingredients. In the case of like ayahuasca, um, or a lot of people will smoke pure DMT, in which case you're also experiencing DMT in a really profoundly different sort of way because it's like a 10-minute experience, and people often give very high doses of the DMT, and they do that because you wouldn't normally want to experience another psychedelic for that long at that high and intense a level. But since
mm,
it's a shorter experience, people will often feel a little bit more comfortable trying kind of those
mm.
high doses.
Yeah, some
Um,
people call it the businessman's psychedelic.
right. Yes. Yeah. Because you can just they can take their lunch break and go do it. I don't think many businessmen actually
No, probably not.
smoke DMT at all,
It's
much less
more
have
modafinil.
right. Yeah, yeah, modafinil by day and Ambien by night. Right. They call that
So,
CEO rocket fuel.
so there are those common experiences, clearly with some of the other psychedelics, but there is one surprising thing that seems to stand out with people who've taken DMT. Apparently, a high percentage of people who use DMT have encounters with higher beings, deities, machine elves, that sort of thing, aliens. Um, and on top of that, the majority of these encounters seem to be positive. What do you think is going on here? Just speculative. No, it doesn't have to have any science here, but
Yeah, I mean, do, does that happen more often with DMT than other psychedelics? I think DMT has that reputation. I don't actually know that there's been any good quality data or science showing that DMT does that more. Certainly, other psychedelics people will have experiences with beings or groups or deities. I think especially in the case of people who smoke DMT or, the spirit molecule was a phrase popularized by Rick Strassman, a researcher who at the time, I don't know if he's still there, he was at University of New Mexico, psychiatrist. And he was giving, he was actually was one of the first people, the first groups to do studies of psychedelics after that long period of dormancy that happened at the end of the 20th century. And he was giving high dose IV DMT, and people were having a lot of those experiences. So, is it the DMT that's causing it? Is it that people are taking these really high doses of the DMT in a way that people normally wouldn't with, say, psilocybin? Like, how many grams of mushrooms did you have to take to
Mm.
get to, um, you know, a high dose DMT experience? Probably at least 5 grams, and maybe even double that. Who knows? Like
Mm.
doses people don't normally take that they feel more comfortable to take, with a shorter acting kind of psychedelic like that.
Mm.
So, yeah, I mean, could the DMT be having specific neurophysiological effects causing, these experiences of entities or robots or beings? Possibly. But yeah, I don't know what else to make of it. Uh, Otherwise, though,
Mm.
what are your thoughts?
You know what it makes me think about? It makes me think about, those little in the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex, and then in the cerebellum you have like the homunculi
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
represent the dedicated neural real estate to, for example, the sensations that we have in our bodies. And so our hands are usually really large and they all look like little elves. If you kind of look at those representations, I don't know if there's any relationship there, but that does make me think, like, if I had to think of this from a sort of materialist viewpoint, or something like that, like, could there be something happening there, like some internal representation gets generated and projected into the outer world or something
Mhm.
like that. But
Right.
I have no idea. That would just be,
That's an interesting idea.
or there are interdimensional beings. I don't know. It's one or the
Could be
other. Like,
both.
right. Okay. So with DMT, like, would you say the risk factors are sort of the same as the LSD and psilocybin, or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess we didn't even, we kind of got, um, went off on some tangents since we started that discussion. I think, also one of the main risk factors we think with psychedelics can be, if people take them and are in a state of sort of psychedelic, altered state of consciousness where they might do unwise things or lose touch with reality, get behind, drive a car on a strong psychedelic experience, not a good idea.
Mm.
Walking, next to traffic, when you're taking a strong psychedelic, probably not a good idea. Being around a weapon, or, in general, we would want people to be, you know, really in a safe place when they take a psychedelic, and potentially have someone there who is not so strongly influenced by the psychedelic to make sure that they don't do anything unwise, because occasionally that does happen.
Mm.
The other thing is, if people have a really bad trip, it can be really traumatizing, and people will, have experience, you know, the term psychedelic was coined by a Canadian psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond. He and Aldous Huxley came up with a contest to see who could come up with the best word, for a
Mm.
psychedelic. And the psychiatrist actually beat the writer, and they each came up with a word and made a little, like, couplet poem for it. And so he invented the word psychedelic,
Mm.
which
Interesting.
literally means mind or spirit, manifesting or revealing, psyche and delos,
Mm.
in Greek. And his couplet was, to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And there's a kind of a lot descriptive in there, in that, so you could have this heavenly like experience, or this hell demonic like experience, and just a pinch of it, kind of alluding to the fact that they can be very potent,
Right.
at low dosages,
Yes.
LSD in particular. Um, Even a pinch of LSD and you'll be taking many, many times the dose of what you should take. So, people, if they have elements of their trip, or even their entire trip, if it's really hellish and terrible, or they're experiencing past traumas, that can be traumatizing psychologically and emotionally to people, we think. So, that's something else that we think, that if we prepare people for psychedelics and they're there with, people who are either therapists or otherwise, maybe from traditional cultures and know how to hold space, or otherwise have a gift for holding space, for people, that probably reduces the likelihood of a bad trip, but maybe doesn't eliminate it completely, because it does happen in a research context sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
um, and people will even possibly meet the criteria for, well, PTSD in a lot of ways afterwards. So
Interesting. Okay. So we're moving close to the end of our time here. Scott, you are basically a modern day shaman.
I wouldn't call myself that,
No? Is
but
that
I mean,
offensive?
Um, because my way of working is probably different than a lot of traditional shamans.
So is it
Albert
more?
Hoffman actually said, that psychiatrists will become the modern day shamans. I I'm not that I have any problem with the way shamans work. I just think that their way of working is very different than the way psychiatrists and therapists way of
Yeah.
working, and so.
Well,
Um,
hence modern, right? That's supposed to be implied, but there are still shamans that work the ways that they traditionally do. So I guess you can't really say modern day.
Yeah, I guess I think a lot of people do look at it, psychiatrists and therapists in that way, and there's probably some overlap there, but there's probably also some crucial differences. Shamans usually come from a lineage um, of shamans kind of teaching each other in ways that psychiatrists don't always do, especially when it comes to psychedelics and
Hmm.
um, there's a lot of other differences of the way shamans kind of work, but yeah, that is sometimes what psychiatrists and therapists are called. I think my interest in this work is, first off, as I've been in what was in private practice in South Florida for almost 10 years, working in the community, and just saw that most psychiatric appointments nowadays are really focused on medications. And I was really getting the impression, and reviewing a lot more of the research, and being like, these medications fail a lot of people. And so feeling like there's a need for psychiatry to have new tools to help people with, depression, anxiety, not to mention a lot of other disorders. So I came to psychedelics, in one way, saying, well, this is an area I think is really promising for helping group of people in such need of help. And depression is one of the leading world causes of disability.
Hmm.
It's a huge public health problem um, internationally. So, there's that element. And I'm also very interested in the spiritual aspects of experience, and the way that, I think our society is shifting so much from, kind of mod or traditional forms of religion. There's been a bit of a vacuum then in terms of how people experience spirituality. I think psychedelics might represent a way to reintroduce what can be a really important aspect of human health, given that most humans over the course of history have had some sort of spiritual or religious experience or practice as part of
Yeah.
their life. And there's a lot of other elements of psychedelics that really, really interest me as well. So I'm super grateful to be able to kind of work in this area of research, and hopeful that this work will end up representing major changes for both mental health treatment, but maybe also a broader sort of societal and sociological shifts, because I do think that this medical and mental health research has opened up a lot of people's minds to, well, maybe these have other sorts of uses beyond what we would consider just treatment for traditional mental health disorders as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Now, would you be, or I don't even know if you're allowed to, given the position you are in your study, but um, would you be open to sharing whether or not you've tried any of these substances, and perhaps sharing one experience that you have had if you did?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and I love to talk about that question a lot. And there's different opinions out there. In general, as a licensed practitioner, it's not wise for us to admit to doing anything illegal. So I won't do that. But to say I've had experiences, with psychedelics that were profound and life changing, and that um, really, shifted, I think, for me, metaphysically, my views in terms of, I was before kind of my first major psychedelic experience, I would have described myself as spiritually agnostic, and not really an area that I was interested in pursuing or exploring. And I had an experience with a psychedelic where I really felt, my sense of self kind of dissolve and melt away, and
Mm,
some other sort of consciousness come into my mind that was remembering that, love is the meaning of kind of existence, and that really shifted my view of the universe and myself in super profound ways. And this was um, nearly 10 years ago, and I would say I'm
mm,
still integrating kind of some of the
Right.
things that I experienced from that particular psychedelic experience into my life now.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that would be probably a
Wow.
short answer to that
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that, Scott. I definitely could relate to the experience that you had in many ways, but also through meditation that I've been able to reach some of those states. Um, and man, I wish we had. Do you have more? Do you have a little more time? How much time do you have left?
Yeah, I got to go in a few minutes, but I can go over a little bit. Sure.
Okay. Yeah, because meditation is to me very fascinating, and to the to pay my respects to Alan Watts, who I think impacted lots of people in the world. But he described it as a bit of like you're on a pogo stick, when you try a psychedelic, and it kind of allows you to hop up and down and jump and see beyond the wall to see, oh, there is this reality that exists there. But when the trip is over, you come down behind the wall, but you're still changed by what you've seen. But
Hmm.
perhaps there's still a way of getting to the other side.
Yeah.
And so, I've been very interested in Eastern wisdom traditions, specifically Taoism and Zen and meditation.
Hmm.
Um, and I know that holotropic breathing is a form of meditation that's supposed to mimic some of the psychedelic experiences. What are your thoughts on that? And do you meditate yourself?
I don't keep a super active meditation practice per
Mm,
se in terms of doing traditional meditation. I've toyed with the idea and think that could be fruitful for me to explore more. Um, I stay present, I would say, more by my experience of nature and the outdoors,
mhm.
and also
Yeah.
some of my relationships. Be curious to hear more kind of about your meditation practices, for sure. In terms of the holotropic breath work, it was actually invented by the most renowned LSD kind of researcher, Stan Groff.
I saw a
Um,
picture with you holding his book, so thought I'd bring
oh
that up.
yes, well, and he kind of discovered it serendipitously. His techniques actually are similar to a lot of traditional kind of breathing techniques that might happen in yoga, pranayama, or other sorts of more traditional cultures. He wasn't necessarily inspired by those, although his techniques that he recommends are similar in a lot of ways. So in some ways, he may have rediscovered some of these breathing techniques that already been used for thousands of years by other groups of
Mm,
people. But basically, he had found that at the end of a psychedelic experience where he'd given someone LSD, they were kind of coming out of the psychedelic effects and they were upset about it. And he told them, well, why don't you just kind of breathe deeply and see if like that can help you manage, what you're experiencing here at the end of this trip. And the patient was like, oh my God, all of a sudden I'm feeling the psychedelic effects back.
mm,
So when LSD basically became completely outlawed and unavailable for medical use or research use, he and his wife switched over to the holotropic breathing because they said, well, it looks like these breathing techniques can also cause altered states of consciousness.
mm,
Um, so yeah, I think there's a lot of different kind of roads to the mountaintop, so to speak, and um, I think for me, what's really interesting is that the doorways that psychedelics can potentially open,
mm,
and the fact that it's not a drug that it seems like you have to take on an ongoing basis to derive long-term benefits from. The way antidepressants nowadays, you usually have to take them daily, and for some people, they might never get off of them because they get a withdrawal when they come off of
mhm,
them. Actually, quite a lot of people that happens. So I think the fact that the psychedelic sort of induces changes to consciousness in the mind and the brain that can open up other sorts of behaviors and ways of thinking and feeling in the world is what's really interesting, even beyond just the experience of the drug effect.
Okay. Excellent. All right, Scott, we're just going to end now with a round of rapid fire questions, which I ask all my guests.
Okay.
So I hope you're okay with that. It won't be longer than 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Name a book you love.
Oh my God. Yeah, there's a lot of books that I love. There's one I just read actually on the near death experience by this author Grayson called Life After Death.
Okay.
Um, I guess I'll just leave it at that. I'd
Yeah.
love to talk more about it, but I'll
Yeah.
stop.
Name a source of inspiration.
My psychedelic experiences.
Hmm. Okay. And what did you want to be when you were a child?
I didn't know.
Ah, okay. What was the first thing that you decided on or thought you would be interested in?
I really didn't choose medicine until I was in my undergrad, and I would say through my childhood and adolescence, I it just wasn't on my mind.
Okay, fair
Yeah,
enough. Favorite type of music?
I like deep house.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Do you play an instrument also?
I didn't grow up playing an instrument, but I do like mix music and kind of DJ as an amateur.
Ah,
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Okay. Um, what is something about yourself that most people don't know?
Hmm. I grew up as in the Mormon religion, although I'm no
Oh,
longer practicing Mormon.
okay. Do you believe in God?
I think so. I don't. Yeah, I don't. It depends on. Yeah, I believe in some sort of higher power, I would
Okay.
say. But I guess what most people would think of as God, I don't necessarily believe in that concept in terms of traditional religion.
Okay. How about free will?
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's degrees of freedom
Mhm.
that people can have. I don't know if people can have a completely free will. I don't think that most humans have a completely free will. No, I
Mm.
think they're very shaped by their genetics and kind of their environment and their upbringing and their surroundings. But I think that people can get more degrees of freedom sometimes over the course of their lives.
Okay. And is our universe meaningless or meaningful?
Both. Yeah,
Okay.
both. Yeah, I think there's there's definite meaning that happens as a result of the human experience, but then there's a lot of areas of the universe that don't seem really that meaningful. If you look at the relative vacuum of outer space, what's the meaning of maybe a couple hydrogen atoms dancing around here and there, way out
Mm.
there, like just from that limited perspective. I
Mm.
don't find that meaningful, but yeah, I would say both.
What's more fundamental to you, matter or consciousness?
Consciousness.
Okay. And last question. This can have a longer response if you'd like. What is the purpose, if any, of human life?
Oh, there's a lot of them, but I think really to love and experience joy are the main purposes.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
This has
this
been great.
interview. Yeah. Thank you for all your knowledge and insights. And if you have any links that you want to share, feel free to send them to me and I could, post them underneath